Welcome to this podcast from the University of Exeter Business School. Today we are talking to Professor Will Harvey and Navdeep Arora about their research into the triggers that compel individuals to commit white-collar crime. We'll be discussing their research and its particular relevance to the current COVID-19 crisis, where both individuals and organisations are under increased pressure. Hello Will, hello Navdeep. Can I start by asking you to explain the background to your collaboration and research?
Hi Toby, great to be here. Well, Navdeep approached me over 3 years ago about a potential PhD project on startup organisations. And to cut a long story short, Navdeep ended up being indicted in a US federal prison. And we were having a telephone call while Navdeep was in prison about his PhD, and he suddenly said to me, "Well, it's really strange, but there are a lot of people like me in the prison." And then a light bulb moment came up in my mind, which was, this has to be the PhD project. If there are lots of highly educated, very smart, professionally successful individuals in one prison, then that would create a wonderful environment to understand what causes white-collar crime and what can we do to prevent it.
And turning to you, Navdeep, what was the motivation for embarking on the research in this area?
Thank you, Toby. The motivation really was, learning from my own mistakes and the mistakes of others just like me to help people in the future.
So fundamentally then, why is there a problem with white-collar crime?
I think from my perspective, we often focus on other kinds of crime, often violent forms of crime. But actually, I think we underplay the importance of white-collar crime, often because the victim is not immediately visible to the person who's perpetrating, and it can take a long time to actually see or understand what kind of impact the crime can have on others. The other aspect is that it's quite a slippery slope, so that once people start to kind of operate unethically, it can lead to other forms of deviant behavior, and quickly it can create a very serious situation. And I think why it's particularly important to understand is that counterintuitively, and even right now, we often think about harsher forms of compliance and greater controls being a way to prevent white-collar crime. But I think what Navdeep and I have found from this study is actually the intent of compliance, regulation, controls, which is to reduce, could actually have the inverse effect if excessively applied.
And looking at the current situation we all find ourselves in, would you say that the risk of white-collar crime has now increased?
Will and I do believe that there's high potential for significant levels of misconduct, driven primarily by greater short-term performance targets and harsher regulations that the post-COVID environment is likely to create.
And is that really, in simple terms, that people just feel more under pressure and are perhaps more driven or willing to take risks that they wouldn't otherwise undertake?
That's precisely right. I think you hit the nail on the head. On the one hand, it would be the pressure to perform against unprecedented corporate targets. On the other hand, it would be much harsher regulations and a very aggressive controls and compliance regimes. And Will and I believe that caught between those two, individuals tend to conflate ethical issues with cost-benefit decisions, and thus a higher likelihood for professional misconduct.
Turning back to the research, my understanding is it's quite unusual in how the research was carried out. Can you explain that?
Happy to, Toby. So as I mentioned, we had this unique situation where Navdeep was an inmate himself, and this presented two opportunities. One is that firstly, gaining access to conduct interviews within a prison is a very difficult thing in terms of ethics approval, getting permission from the prison service. And secondly, because of Navdeep's position in relation to others that he was interviewing, that also really opened up an opportunity for a much more candid and honest insight, which would not necessarily be possible if someone was coming from the outside, so to speak. So that was a great opportunity. And from that, then Navdeep conducted 3 rounds of interviews with 70 inmates in a US federal prison. In addition, he did close to a dozen focus groups with those same individuals to try and sort of tease out some of the issues that we were looking at in terms of what causes people to act unethically and commit misconduct, and also to understand what these people are doing to rehabilitate. Also, you see, because Navdeep was in the prison himself, he had the opportunity to follow up from these types of interviews and focus groups informally with people. And this is where a lot of tacit knowledge and interesting insights start to come. And finally, we had great cooperation with the prison officers as well. Both Navdeep and myself had several conversations so that they were able to give us a slightly different insight and lens to that which the inmates were providing. So overall, I think this is a very unique and rich source of data to understand the causes of professional misconduct.
And in terms of what you found from the research, what were the principal findings?
There are 3 key findings that I would like to headline. Number 1, counter to prevailing perceptions and thinking, greed only plays a very small part in driving professional misconduct and unethical behavior. Number 2, we have found that most of the highly educated and successful and intelligent professionals sleepwalk across ethical lines over time. They end up on this slippery slope and do not even realize when they've crossed ethical lines. And number 3, this crossing the ethical line comes about as an interplay, as an interaction of several individual triggers, along with several organizational factors and the environmental context. By environmental context, I'm referring to, for example, the level of regulation, controls, and compliance in our socioeconomic world.
Thank you. And I guess the thing that jumps out there for me is the fact that greed only plays a small part. I think most people would expect that actually greed is the root of evil, in that people are doing this to get more money or more power. But your research then says that actually is not really the primary motivation.
That is precisely correct. In our study, less than 10% of the people were actually driven by financial incentives. The rest of the people, I think it was a combination of 5 or 6 different individual triggers, and I'll highlight a few of those. One was burden of custodianship. The second one was fear of failure. And failure, when I talk about failure, I'm not talking about the failure in terms of monetary incentives, but failure in terms of being able to pursue a certain lifestyle, failure in terms of being able to have a certain occupation and enjoy the type of professional respect that people enjoy. The third one I would like to highlight is unique personal beliefs and values that some people have. The fourth one, another interesting one that we found quite predominant among the participants of our research, was ego and hubris that normally sets in after people have been very successful and have worked for large organizations that are regarded as industry leaders and watchdogs, and end up building this sense of invincibility. And so those are the factors that really come together, along with organizational factors and the environmental context, to push people over ethical lines.
Thank you. And talking about the environmental factors at the moment, I mean, we find ourselves in this extraordinary environment where we're all under increased pressure. So what does the research really point to about the risks in the current situation we find ourselves in?
I think building on what Navdeep has just said, I think organizations need to really reflect on those 3 broad areas. So what is happening at an individual level, trying to understand a person's own context, whether that's a family context, whether it's a personal context. Second is thinking very carefully about what is going on right now within the organization, what's its health, what's the culture of the organization, what types of behaviors are we observing within the organization. And then, of course, as you've just alluded to, Toby, the wider environment right now is extremely challenging, very stressful, inhibiting at best for most people, and debilitating and extremely costly at worst. And so my sort of message to others is not to fixate on any one of those three levels, the individual, the organization, and the environment, but to really think about all three working in tandem, because it's actually quite rare, let's say, for an individual factor to operate in isolation from the others and vice versa. So really trying to understand the bigger picture alongside the kind of the small micro level picture is probably the best way to truly understand the risk as an organization you have to potential misconduct.
And I guess really in talking about the risk, if you don't get this right, the cost to an individual and organisation and the damage can be huge. It was Navdeep. I'm sure that's obviously very personal to you, but I mean there is a big cost to this.
Yes, Toby, absolutely. And there are, I would say, three dimensions of that cost. I think one is obviously the individual reputation. As I can relate to this, I had a marvelously successful career. Became a senior partner at McKinsey & Company. And, I believe I did a million good things, but one small mistake brought it all down to the ground. Number two is the reputation of the organization that you represent. And, the lives and careers of hundreds others that you have mentored and coached in the past that you're staking. And number three, I would say the most devastating, and the one that I would have, that by far exceeds anything I could have suffered in my life is the devastation and the anguish caused to our families, friends, and others who have counted on us and believed in us.
Thank you for sharing that, Navdeep. That's really insightful. I guess moving on to sort of the practical elements of this, in order to avoid unethical and illegal behaviour, what are some of the steps that we need to consider?
That's a great question, Toby, and I think I'll sum up our findings into one massive headline, which is, rather than focusing on firefighting a problem and being reactive, the answer to this is to really understand the genesis, the root causes, and the chain link of triggers that lead to the problem. And as Will alluded to earlier, there are three parts to this: the individual triggers, who are the people, the people who actually cause these problems at the front line, the organizations that at times contribute to the conditions that trigger those responses from individuals, and behind the scenes, the environmental context, for example, the regulatory control and compliance regime that at times pushes people to take actions that result in professional misconduct. So I think to sum it all up, it's all about understanding the root causes and the chain link of those triggers, and then proactively mitigating and preventing those.
In terms of your advice for both individual managers at this time and organisations as a whole, how would you sum that up?
I would broadly say three important things here. One, and arguably most important, understand your people well. You need to support them right now. This is a very difficult time. And try and proactively find out where the problems exist, because often where the problems exist are the root causes of some of the issues at hand. Secondly, every organization has a culture. So I think it's really ensuring that as an organization, your mission, your values, and the goals are suitable for your organization. They're clear for your members, your employees, and importantly, that they translate into the types of behaviors that you would expect from them. And then thirdly, I think it's reflecting on how the wider environment can both support and at times damage the well-being of your organization and its employees. And unfortunately right now, of course, in most cases, that the wider context is extremely damaging. And I use that term damaging in the broadest sense. That's not to say there aren't opportunities and potentials as well, but unfortunately most of the challenges are damaging. And so those three insights, I think, really come back to what sort of come through so strongly from the data from this study, which is the causes of a lot of these challenges, sit at the individual level, the organizational level, and the environmental level. And so if you can work at those three levels in tandem, then that not only makes your organization healthy, and it also helps to prevent this problem of misconduct, which has been the centrality of our discussion today.
As a last point, I guess, Navdeep, would you have anything to say to the leaders of organizations, CEOs, people tasked with the head of many of our companies? What's your advice for them?
That's an excellent question, Toby. And, it brings to mind Peter Drucker's famous saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. The real question then is, how do we create the right culture and translate that into the kind of behaviors that we want, our people to espouse? I'll sum it up in 3 bullets. Will and I have found through our research that there are 3 factors, 3 very tangible things that can help leaders build the right organization, in addition to, of course, establishing the right values in the organization that Will talked about. Number 1, providing social anchoring to employees to prevent isolation during times of stress, the type of stress that we believe employees are going to undergo in the post-COVID environment. Number 2, decoupling standards for business and ethical decisions. I think what we have found is that under duress, under pressure, people tend to conflate ethical issues with cost-benefit decisions. Number 3, reducing sources of friction within organizations and providing incentives for people to undertake the right behaviors. And I think what I specifically mean is when people are in trouble, giving them a respectful out, a graceful out of these situations can prevent serious levels of professional misconduct that we believe we might be exposed to in the times to come.
Great. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Navdeep and Will. That's an absolutely fascinating insight into your research and work. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Toby.